That's
Awesome. So thanks for taking this time to talk. For people who were listening, the kind of genesis of this, I think we had we were talking on Twitter like 2 months ago about like who we think are like the most impactful, important human beings of all time. The question was, where does Elon Musk fall on that list currently? And like, where do we think that he's going to fall eventually? I guess like we can start out like if you were to make a list of like your top five most important humans, like who would you put on that list?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the way that conversation started, I was super intrigued by the idea. Because like you said with Elon, we're yet to see where he falls. So if I had to go with today with what we know, and come up with a top five, I mean, do you want me to just give it to you straight and then we can work through one by one, or kind
Yeah.
of
To be honest, I need to start doing more prep for these episodes because I don't have like a structure. So feel free to give it straight, and then we can go through one by one, or I can give my list too, and then we can talk through it.
Yeah, I guess we can both give our five and then compare and get into some interesting discussions. So I'll go from five to one. So number five for me maybe will ruffle some feathers. It's a bit of an interesting choice, but I can get into it later. At five, I have Steve Jobs. Um, Moving to four, I put Christopher Columbus. Number three, I decided to go with Abraham Lincoln. Number two, and this one I think people won't quite understand until I get into it, but number two, and this one's key for me, is Johannes Gutenberg, the inventor of the printing press. And number one, I had to go with Jesus. Um,
Okay.
that I put a good deal of thought into that, and that's kind of what I came away with. So Jesus, Gutenberg, Abraham Lincoln, Christopher Columbus, and Steve Jobs to round out my top five.
So our lists are actually like pretty similar. So going five to one, my number five is George Washington. Um,
Okay.
I think that both of us kind of have a spot of like, this understanding that like, there's been this giant hockey stick of improvement of humanity over the past 150 years that probably wouldn't be uh able to have occurred if it wasn't for America, like just to be kind of America's centric about it. And like
Yep.
I think you're giving more to Abraham Lincoln, I'm giving more to George Washington. Number
Hmm.
four, and this is kind of the Jesus spot, but I actually give it to St. Paul. Just
Okay.
because I see him as being the person who actually like really spread Christianity. I might also be biased because my name is Paul, so there's a little bit there probably. Number three, I put Newton. I think your number three was Newton also, right?
My three was Lincoln. I did not have Newton on my list, but that was a tough choice to leave off for me. I had him in consideration.
Yeah, I then had Gutenberg number two, and for me,
Okay.
I put Columbus number one.
Okay. Awesome. So we have a two overlap and then very similar themes for some of the others. So,
One thing I find interesting is that both of ours only have one head of state on it, and
mm,
the way that history is really taught, um, because history is kind of taught as like a sitcom or as like a drama series, and like the most dramatic parts of history, I think, are the wars and who fought in this, who did that, but like fundamentally those things like the winner. I mean, like the 30 Years' War obviously had importance, but like at the end of the day, like the people who actually transform the world, at least according to both of us, are people who actually like make stuff that changes things, right?
yeah, so I had this like self-discussion with myself, kind of figuring out how I was going to approach this. And what I came down to was like the question to me, as I understood it, is who are the five individuals that have fundamentally changed the course of history
Yeah,
more than any other, right? And so that comes down to changing, whether that's science or our understanding of the world itself or uh, spiritual, so a religious figure. Heads of state have a massive role to play in our understanding of history, but like you won't find Genghis Khan or Alexander the Great or Napoleon on my list because while they did amazing things and were great figures, I don't think they reached that level of fundamentally changing the course of history like some of
Yeah.
these other figures do.
No, I completely agree. I mean, so I know we're kind of jumping around a little bit, but like one thing with Steve Jobs for me, like I think I'm a lot more history bias than yours. Or like
Mm,
have just like a lot more older figures. I mean, to
mm,
be fair, both relatively five people. So, just one difference makes a huge difference. One thing with Steve Jobs for me is like I'm not exactly certain. Like I feel like if you were to go back in time to the mid 1400s during Gutenberg's time, I'm pretty sure there were like a bunch of other inventors who had comparable things, and it just turned out that looking back on it from 500 years, it's like Gutenberg was the guy. And like
mhm.
I think that if you look back on now, 500 years from now, who knows, maybe AI will take over. It'll be AI looking back 500 years from now. But I think that there's a good case to be made that Steve Jobs will be that person who gets shaken out, especially given um how he really made technology ubiquitous. Really made it something that like not just nerds doing their garages, but now everybody's on their phone constantly. But for me, like the question is like, is it Steve Jobs? Is it Bill Gates? Is it
Mm.
Mark Zuckerberg? Because WhatsApp, is gonna, has a huge role to play pretty much everywhere else except for the United States.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, one thing I really didn't want to do when I made this list was succumb to recency bias,
Yeah,
which it'd be so easy to just look at the past 100, 200 years and go, okay, who's the biggest figure that I can think of? Because obviously we're going to be biased towards recent history. We know it much better. We're kind of living its consequences much more. But I couldn't get away from the nagging thought that like the personal computing revolution, and I think you nailed it right there with the idea of making technology ubiquitous as one of the most like fundamental shifts in human civilization that we might ever see. Um, and something that's very hard to judge because we're still living it today, right? We are on the hockey stick incline of the exponential.
yeah,
Um, and so I wanted to sort of try to pinpoint an individual.
yeah,
Um, I played around with Bill Gates for this spot, and if there was one person who like really led the personal computing revolution, um, that person was going to get that slot for me because I think it's just so critical in, the next 50 to 100 years of human progress. And for me, I thought Steve Jobs because um, just the idea of putting essentially a supercomputer in everybody's pocket, making it ubiquitous, making it just a facet of everyday life, and also making it cool, making it public, mainstream. Like you said, it's not technology is not just something nerds do in their garage. Um, Making computers the fundamental part of our life and of the functioning of human civilization. I think we owe a lot of that to Steve Jobs. And maybe it's a bit early, but I think when things shake out, I think he'll have earned that spot.
no, definitely. I definitely think that that's like um I'd even say like a much more bold decision than my decision to keep him out. I'm using bold in like the Roman fortune favors the bold type of way as a compliment.
Mm.
But like it really is like crazy. Like if you think back on it, like in the 90s, I mean, like I was born, I was raised in the 90s. I'm sure it was even worse in the 80s, where like anybody doing anything on a computer was seen as like a nerd, right? Like if you're on a
Right.
computer, it's like, bro, go fuck some chicks type of thing. Now, like, I mean, if you want to fuck some chicks, you have to use a computer, but like
Yeah.
literally everybody's on a computer now. And like I remember like um the one Aaron Sorkin movie about technology that I like is his movie about Steve Jobs. I thought it was like brilliantly done. And in the movie, Steve Jobs says, like, what if a computer is a bicycle for the mind? And it really is like, a bicycle for the mind.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So why not Newton? What did he get?
Newton was Newton was a tough one to leave off. Maybe it's because I'm not much of a scientist. Um, and so I can't like adequately judge the impact he had on science. Um, for me, it was more just like these other figures taking precedence, not so much him not rising to the level of, top five. He'd definitely be top 10 if I had to like make an extended list.
Yeah.
Um, Newton was a tough one to leave off. Just I think he just got, kicked down a couple notches from looking at these other figures and thinking, you know, their achievements or their impact was just a little bit bigger.
Yeah. One kind of observation I have about both of our lists just now, and it's kind of top of mind because I made a video yesterday about Columbus, where like there's a
Mhm.
huge anti-Columbus backlash that's been occurring for
Yep.
the past like 10, 15 years. And putting the stuff with the natives aside, I go into more depth, but I don't really want to talk about that right now. But like one of the big attacks on Columbus is he didn't discover that the world was round. The Greeks knew that for a while. The Vikings discovered America. It wasn't him. And I find it interesting that you have the same attacks on him that you have on like Steve Jobs as well, right? Where it's like, oh, it was Wozniak who did this. He didn't actually invent the computer. You actually have similar attacks on Gutenberg too, which I think is kind of
Mm.
weird. And then you even have some, similar attacks on the story of Jesus. And I guess like kind of want to hear your thoughts on like what is it about people that like makes us like A, do you think those are legitimate critiques, but like B, like what do you think it is about us that makes us need to take these like fundamental, people who really shaped humanity and like tear them down in these types of ways or like undermine their achievements?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things there. Number one, I think is sort of our desire for like special people to be unique,
Yeah,
right? So if we can look at someone like Columbus, it's very easy to go, oh, well, he wasn't the first. The Vikings got there first. We're super obsessed with who did it first, who did it in the most unique way. Um, but to me, that makes no sense. And if we're talking about someone like Columbus, to me, the most important thing is what change did he precipitate? The Vikings didn't precipitate any big historical change. Yeah, they got there, maybe had a few colonies, and they left. Um, but what Columbus did is he precipitated one of the most like fundamental changes in world history, which was the colonization of the Americas. The European conquest of two whole continents, an entire half of the world. Did he do that? No, but he started it. And that's kind of why I give him this place on my list. And then the second part of your question, like why the desire to tear these people down, that's a more interesting question. Like I think it's partly because of our recency bias and you know the idea that if someone did something, well, okay, someone else is going to come along and do it later if not. So these people actually aren't that special, right? I've heard people argue that. And
yeah,
I think it's a broader trend too of getting away from the sort of great man theory of history. It's very like academically trendy these days to focus on historical patterns and trends and to give them all the agency and not the people.
yeah. Yeah, and to be honest, like I think my personal opinion on it is I think it's like a pretty destructive trend because like you can kind of say like oh like somebody else would have done it, but like you know the Atlantic Ocean was there for thousands of years, and nobody in human history had the balls to just sail, just sail west, right? And like we could think that like oh it would happen 30, 40, 50 years later, but it could have never happened, right? It could, I mean, not never, but it could have been another 500 years until it happened. And as you said, like the discovery of the Americas was one of the most important events in human history. Not just, uh, in terms of like the founding of America, you now have like two different groups of Europeans competing against each other. There's a really great quote by Christine Lagarde, who's a former head of the European Central Bank, where she said there used to be two types of people in Europe: risk takers and people who were afraid of risk, and then all the risk takers went into America. And I think it's like you compare America and Europe, it really is like an interesting two petri dishes of like you know risk takers versus non-risk takers and how that shakes out. I guess like one reason why I asked this question, and like sort of circling it back, is that we see similar types of criticisms of Elon Musk all the time. Right, like, oh,
Mm.
he didn't actually start Tesla. It was these two other guys. As if like if Elon Musk didn't get involved in Tesla, Tesla would be the same trillion-dollar company, but just run by these two other guys. He didn't actually, think of PayPal. It was really Peter Thiel's idea. Um, and yeah, like we see that same type of tearing down of Elon Musk that we do see of people like Columbus, of Gutenberg, of all these historical figures.
Yeah, with Elon, you get the typical like, oh, he could only do it because of his father's emerald mine, or Bezos could only found Amazon because he got a loan from his parents, or these BS claims, and it's like, okay, if someone gave you $100,000, I don't think you'd build Amazon. Like,
Yeah,
it's not the seed money that makes these people great.
yeah,
Um, but I wonder, and this is just like a thought. I don't have actually any evidence to back this up, but I wonder how much it is that greatness really threatens people at like an individual level, and then like an egotistical level. You see these people doing great things, and maybe it's like a defensive response of I want to tear them down because of how I feel about myself. Um, and the way that generalizes to the public is it becomes trendy to tear down someone like a Jeff Bezos or an Elon Musk.
yeah. I mean, I've been thinking about this, and I think that like, there are just sort of like different types of people in this world, and there are people who see greatness and get really inspired by it and want to act. And then there are a lot
Mm,
of other people, and I don't think there's anything inherent. I think, a lot of it comes down to socialization, but like a lot
yeah.
of people who just kind of, you know, the idea of not doing things is very appealing to them. And as you said, like it is threatening when someone goes out and does it because then it's sort of like shines the light back on them in a bad way. And again, like, there are two different reactions to that. There is the, oh, wow, Elon Musk built this trillion-dollar company. What am I doing? Let me get off my ass and do it. And then there's the other one where it's like, I need to tear him down for me to feel better about myself.
Right. The easiest way, if you're that second type of person, would be to just basically remove his agency
Yeah.
and say, oh, there's greater forces at work that led him to doing this. Because that then allows you to offload a lot of the responsibility for your own life to those same trends and historical patterns. Oh, I could have done that too if only I was in his position, right?
Yeah.
You see that.
I
So,
mean, I even like with the critiques. I mean, I think that the whole Emerald Mine and the $100,000 stuff, like, I think it's silly, just like factually inaccurate, right? But like, even if
right.
it was true, like my perspective on that is that like we're picking the five richest people on Earth, right? And like all else being equal, let's say success is purely driven by IQ. Obviously, we know it's not, but like let's just use that for the purpose of this conversation, right? Like if Elon Musk has, if there's a kid who's down as an emerald mine who has 150 IQ or 200 IQ, and there's somebody kid who doesn't, who has a 200 IQ, both are going to be very successful, but the one with that extra money is just going to be more successful, obviously, because they have that extra advantage, right? So, like, yes, the fact that like the top five richest people in the world, even buying the argument that they had some sort of leg up, like you would expect the five richest people in the world to have some leg up because it is very difficult to become the richest person in the world to begin with, right?
Right. Yeah. You already have to have a small advantage. But then again, there's plenty of rich kids in this world, you know?
Yeah,
Plenty emerald mines with the owners that have kids, and I don't see any of them building rockets to go to the moon, right? So there's the importance of the individual there.
yeah, and I guess like kind of like a bigger question coming off of that is that like because I remember like reading a biography of Elon and he talked a lot about the importance of sci-fi in like shaping his like worldview and
Mm.
like what do you think is the kind of importance of like having these types of figures that people look up to in order to inspire like a next generation to do great things.
I think it's very difficult to get new ideas in the mainstream. So take the idea of a colony on Mars. That's a wild idea. Like by any stretch of the imagination, by any measure, that's a pretty wild idea.
Yeah,
Um, and many people throughout history have talked about it. I mean, it's not a new idea,
yeah,
but to bring that idea to a level of both mainstream, um, and then eventually bringing people onto the idea that okay, this actually could happen. It takes a very special person to do that. And that's like when we talk about influential figures in history, that's what they do, is they fundamentally reshape the world in a way that no one else was doing. Um, that's why I think Elon, when all is said and done, will be up there on top five. I don't think you can start a colony on another planet and not deserve to be the upper echelon of influential humans.
yeah. Do you think he's gonna end up number one?
He'll be top three for sure. Like uh, on anybody's list. I think it's just such a monumental leap. Um, and it's, these monumental leaps throughout history are very rarely the concerted effort of an individual. Um, these are usually much greater forces, entire kingdoms. Like when we're looking at individuals, some of the biggest things in history, you can't just pinpoint an individual. They're broader. It's bigger than that.
Yeah,
But like getting to the moon, for example, is one of the most like incredible feats of human civilization. But there's no
yeah,
one person that you can say, okay, they did that, right? It's NASA, it's America, it's maybe JFK has a little bit to do with that. But with Elon, it really is so much his drive and desire to make that happen.
yeah. And I think that might be like part of the reason why people discount people like Elon and people like Steve Jobs, even people like Columbus, is that like it seems that fundamentally the thing that we're missing as a civilization of accomplishing greater things is that drive to make it happen. And
Mhm.
the fact that, we have, these people who literally just, for thousands of years we could have crossed the ocean blue, but it took this one lunatic in 1492 to do it, to actually say we're going to do it. um you know Again, as we're talking about, like there are two reactions to seeing greatness: one shining a light and being inspired, and the other one saying like, hey, I need to tear that down. And uh you know what these people kind of prove is that the only limitation of our civilization really is ourself and our own like imagination.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Columbus is an interesting example of this to kind of bring it back to him. Uh, I'm a proponent of the idea we have of Columbus in popular sort of history is probably pretty wrong, at least the way it's taught in America. It's become sort of fashionable in at least America to teach Columbus as this almost like bumbling idiot who just happened upon America. Like, oh, Columbus thought he was going to Asia, and this idiot didn't realize there was a whole continent in the middle,
Yeah,
and he just got lucky, right? Or this sort of narrative. I actually have reason to believe that's all pretty false. In my own understanding of the history of Columbus, I think he knew what he was going out to find. He was a very shrewd businessman. He goes to the Spanish court basically to ask for funding for this journey west, and he couches it in the idea of, okay, I'm going to go to Asia, find some new trading routes, et cetera, make a lot of money. He makes certain, and he takes certain like pain to get this in the terms that under the terms of the agreement, he will get ownership of any lands that he's able to find and conquer, etc. If he actually believes that he is headed to Asia, where, I mean, the Europeans and the Portuguese, the Spanish, they knew well what Asia was like. They knew there were kingdoms out there, rich kingdoms to trade with. There was no conquering in mind. They were going
Yeah.
to find trade routes. They were sailors. So
Hmm.
for him to take the liberty of like insisting on ownership of conquered lands, to me is sort of evidence that he was being very shrewd, that
Yeah.
he had an idea of something out there, something unoccupied, something different. And there's actually a history of the Genoese sailors, of which he was one of the best, um, having an inkling that something was out there. Um, and they had the most impressive understanding of the ocean currents. Some Genoese sailors had gone far out into the Atlantic, and this was sort of like guild knowledge at the time that only him and a few others would have been privy to.
Hmm.
I mean, there's even hints that he got up to northern Great Britain, Iceland, and probably heard tales of the Vikings heading west to the Americas and finding a land out there. There's a possibility he was privy to that information. So I see Columbus more in that light of he was actually a shrewd figure who knew what he was doing and didn't just happen upon a lost continent. He had an idea.
Huh. I never heard that, but that would be even more interesting. And I could definitely see that as a possibility because you do have, you know, a lot of instances where, just professionals in the field just like have this knowledge that is only discovered like 50 to 100 years later, but like these people like knew it because of like, as you said, like currents and a whole lot of other factors as well.
Yeah, the Genoese sailors, obviously come from Genoa, Italy. They were the best sailors of the time.
Yeah.
Um, had extensive work basically sailing out far into the Atlantic. They were sailing further than anyone else at the time. So if there was anyone who had an idea of the Americas existing, it would have been these sailors. And it was almost like a guild. It was any sort of valuable knowledge would have been kept highly under wraps and would have
Yeah.
been very like kept amongst these tight groups of sailors. So there's an interesting theory there. I can link you to it. There's a longer piece that someone else wrote about this. I can try to find for you after this, but
Yeah,
that's
definitely.
my that's my little piece of alternate history.
Would love that. I've been reading about Columbus a lot. As I mentioned, I made a video about this yesterday. Like, it turns out that like, so there's this like report that people point to like talk about like Columbus's atrocities, and like the
Mm,
critique of Columbus that people make is that it's not just that he was bad, because people have kind of realized that like you got to judge people by their standards, but that he was
sure.
bad by the standards of his time. And so
Mhm.
the story that people are taught is that Columbus came to America, wreaked havoc on everybody, and then the Spanish arrested him and threw him into prison and took his lands away, right? And then they just stopped the story there. And actually, the second part of the story is that the person who wrote the report on Columbus was the person who got Columbus's lands after he was
Mm.
arrested. And then Columbus was in prison for like 6 months. And then during that 6 months, the Spanish crown investigated him and they found that all these stories were bullshit. And so they gave him his lands back. I think they even arrested the other guy. And then Columbus went on like a fourth expedition. So like it's like a weird thing where like it's like a redemption arc story where they stop it in the middle. Uh but yeah, I mean obviously like what Columbus did, what the Spanish did was brutal and like terrible. I mean, I'm of the belief that just the world was brutal and terrible in the 1500s. But people have this
Yeah.
narrative about Columbus that like he exceeded the boundaries of what even the Spanish thought was acceptable. And all the evidence for that goes in the opposite direction because the evidence that was created was literally like a dude who like wanted Columbus's job basically, and so got him fired.
Yeah, that's a definitely a cautionary tale for how we reinterpret history
Yeah.
because I think history is littered with stuff like that. The victors write the history, and we have to be maybe a bit more shrewd than that, see through that.
Yeah, so I'm on a free Zoom, so we have like 10 minutes left. But I guess like one thing I love for you to talk about if you don't mind is just talk about like the technology brother a little bit and like what you're building out.
Yeah, sure. So the Technology Brother is sort of a joint effort. It's me along with a couple other individuals who I actually had the honor of meeting in person. They sort of were the originators behind the idea. They brought me on to make it real. But what we're
In Istanbul, right?
yeah, Istanbul was actually like a family trip, but
Oh,
I got to meet Radka in Istanbul, which was a blast. We had a great time.
nice.
Always meet your mutuals. They're really cool people on the internet. But yeah, with the technology brother, we essentially saw an issue that many people have also pointed out. That is the tech media ecosystem as a whole has sort of become very anti-tech, anti-progress, very hostile to developments in technology. So we wanted to sort of bring about a new tech media that is like unabashedly pro-tech, techno-optimist, and sort of embody those principles, vaguely EAC aligned principles, right? So
Yeah,
it's still in the very early stages, but we're essentially hoping to build out a whole new tech media publication that starts from the basis of we are tech optimists and we are going to talk about and report on tech from that lens to
yeah.
sort of counter the current landscape.
It is an interesting dynamic where like most of the people who it seems who go into tech media are not tech people whatsoever. Like they're
Mhm.
journalistic people, and
Yep.
journalistic people and tech people are just fundamentally different types of people. So like it makes sense as to why they have such aversion towards tech, but it's weird that those are the people who dominate the conversation about tech.
Yeah, we live in a world where today, if you want to do any sort of journalism, you sort of have to have that more standard journalist background. A bachelor or master's in journalism from a top journalism school. So all of our journalists are coming from the same place, which to me makes no sense.
Yeah.
You would want a tech journalist to come from tech. You would want a politics journalist to come from politics. And this sort of happens in other areas of journalism, but for whatever reason, tech journalism is mostly run by journalists and not technologists, which to me feels backwards.
Yeah.
Um,
You also typically need like a father who's an executive vice president at Goldman Sachs in order to fund your first 5 years of unpaid internships. But
yep.
that's a different story altogether.
Different
um,
story. Yeah.
so while I have like a time ticker clicking down, but I guess like what do you think is like one of the most interesting stories in tech? Like I'm not talking about like wide, large scale stories, but like the big stuff on the front pages of the news this week, last week, this month. Do you think it's GPT 4.0?
From my point of view, absolutely. I think that's the next big thing that we're seeing. It's really two things. It's OpenAI's GPT 4.0, and then it's everything that Google talked about a day later, their
Yeah.
Project Astra. They're also releasing a new image generator in Veo, which will compete against Sora, presumably. Um, and it's a continuation of a trend in AI towards more agentic, more like AI assistant um, products. And I think GPT 4.0, as it was demoed, to me, looks like another ChatGPT, where ChatGPT was the big step that brought AI chatbots to the mainstream. I think in the form it took in the demo, GPT 4.0 will bring the AI assistant to the mainstream in a similar way and really change the public's perception of what AI is and what it can do.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Do you think that like Google's kind of cooked? Because like I remember like a decade ago when I first started working in tech, showing how old I am. I remember like I had a conversation with somebody where he like mentioned he worked at Google, and this is like right when I got into San Francisco. I was like, oh my god, that's awesome, and like he like rolled his eyes and started like unloading on me. And like one of the first lessons I learned in San Francisco was that working at Google is absolutely terrible. Everybody who I've spoken to like absolutely hated it because like the bureaucracy and stuff. And then you
Mhm.
start seeing how OpenAI leapfrog them in terms of artificial intelligence. And now it just seems that like they're losing every single race that's occurring right now.
Yeah, I think part of this is the like typical trend you see with as companies get bigger and bigger, they get like more um slower and lethargic. They lack the ability to be dynamic like a small company in OpenAI is able to do.
Yeah.
Um, and like you said, the capitulation to a lot of different values, the bureaucracy sort of reigning supreme, the more middle managers you get in the picture, the harder it is to get anything done. And my feeling isn't that Google is necessarily cooked, but they're certainly falling behind. I mean, their Google I/O event was impressive and seemed to be on a similar level to OpenAI, but I think in reality they're further behind um,
I
because
feel like
everyone's
everyone's like making fun of that rollout, especially because that DJ, those videos that came out. Well, I guess like to bring it full circle, I guess they really need like a great man of history who could like revitalize them as an organization, the way like a Columbus or like an Elon Musk would.
they do. I mean, if you look at the tech companies of today, Sundar Pichai is great, but he's no Steve Jobs. Tim Cook of Apple, definitely no Steve Jobs. I think the only figure you get that sort of resembles that sort of like blazing figure is sort of a Sam Altman. I think he's the only one who sort of fits the mold just with what he's been able to do.
Yeah.
And the loyalty he requires, the level of control he has over what his company does, which is why I think the company that emerges the winner of this is probably OpenAI in the long run.
Yeah, it is interesting that Apple really hasn't released a great product since Steve Jobs died. And the Vision
Yeah.
Pro, I know that like a lot of people in like EAC, like techno optimism, really like hyped the Vision Pro up because I think that like everyone wanted to see Apple like, you know, go back to its old self. But I think that it's been kind of clear that the Vision Pro just on the overall market, like people aren't buying it.
Yeah, I think also a lot of people want to see VR really succeed.
Yeah.
And clearly it's not there yet by for whatever reason. The public isn't as into it as maybe they would have hoped. Um, but yeah, Apple feels a bit cooked to me.
Awesome. Well, yeah. So I guess we'll check back in 500 years, but it seems like Elon Musk, Steve Jobs, and Sam Altman will be on the top of the list.
Yeah, and then hopefully we'll all still be kicking 500 years. We'll have solved longevity and we'll be immortal and we'll be at a place where we can actually go back and reevaluate our top five.